Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to be here and have Robert Fieseler here today. Robert is a journalist and the author of the acclaimed debut book Tinderbox, winner of the Edgar Award, the Louisiana Literary Award, and Lambda Literary's Judith A. Markowitz Award for Emerging Writers. Fieseler graduated co-valedictorian from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and is a recipient of the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship. He lives with his husband in New Orleans. And we are so honored and excited to have you here today to read to us and tell us more about your book, Tinderbox, the untold story of the upstairs lounge fire and the rise of gay liberation. As we are a college here in New Orleans, getting to hear an actual story of LGBT history, though a tragic story, we understand how important is these stories are told, and are so glad to have someone who has what to share with us about this part of our history that, as I'm sure you'll tell us more about, is not spoken about or understood as well as it should be. And so we are so glad to have you here, Robert. And this event is sponsored by Poets and Writers and the Delgado English Department. So thank you to Poets and Writers and the Delgado English Department for making this possible.
Yeah.
Woohoo! Without further ado, I'll pass this intro off to Courtney.
Hi, I'm Courtney Sharp, and I work in the Human Resources Department. And it's a great honor for me to welcome tonight's reader to our virtual campus. Tonight, Bobby's going to read some passages about our mutual friend and local community activist, Stuart Butler, who had a tremendous impact on the local community and was a huge supporter of the trans community starting in the mid-1990s when we met until the end of his life last February. Stuart's activism is connected to the upstairs lounge fire. 31 men and 1 woman died in the upstairs lounge fire on June the 24th, 1973. We remember and honor them tonight. Because of our community connectedness, the stories of activists today have roots in the events of the upstairs fire lounge. And I thank Bobby for his research and his writing skills and his love for the community to ensure that this important story was brought to light and documented in his book. So please welcome my friend, Bobby.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you, Delgado. Thank you to Poets and Writers. And thank you so much, Shayna, for that introduction. And thank you, Courtney. You honor me so much by introducing me. Courtney Sharp, I don't know, many of you know, was a protege of the upstairs lounge survivor turned important Louisiana activist, Stuart Butler. And Stuart and Courtney teamed side by side in the late 90s to make New Orleans together through their efforts lobby and pass a non-discrimination ordinance that protected not just for sexual orientation, but for gender identity. Very, very early on. This is a southern city in the 20th century that passed a non-discrimination ordinance. So it's so significant. And Courtney, I'm so honored to have just any aspect of that lineage here. Your work was and is so important and should be known and honored by a lot of different people. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So I am Robert Fieseler. That's my name, or Bobby. Everyone calls me Bobby. I wrote this book, Tinderbox, the untold story of the upstairs lounge fire and the rise of gay liberation. Tinderbox is a work of nonfiction. And it's a historical inquiry about a notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place at a gay bar in 1973 New Orleans and claimed 32 lives. It was the deadliest fire on record in US history and the worst mass killing of gay and lesbians actually in US history until the 2016 massacre at Pulse. And the deadliest fire on record, in New Orleans history. And yet, despite all of that, it was this event was deemed received just a few days of media inquiry in its time due to massive anti-gay bigotry. Despite a bounty of evidence pointing towards a chief suspect an internally conflicted gay for pay hustler named Roger Dale Nunez, who was ejected from the bar on the night of the fire. This crime, this calamity was deemed politically inconvenient in its time due to its queer overtones, and thus permitted to become the historic mystery that it is now. The upstairs lounge fire is still considered an unsolved crime, despite the presence of an orgy of evidence pointing towards the primary suspect, who was ejected from the bar, screaming as he was ejected from the bar the night of the fire, quote, "I'm gonna burn you all out," right? That's what criminologists call motive. But despite all of that, the fire still lingers oddly in New Orleans history. And so that means, and it was really only recently reclaimed and spoken about publicly in this century. And so this is an event that I think needs to be told and retold locally as many times as possible, because strangely enough, the story of the upstairs lounge has a way of disappearing in this town. And when history like this disappears, it creates a causal consequential effect. And it reminds me of this quote I thought of that James Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, which is, he's talking about history that created civil rights strife in the South. In writing about it, he talks about people in the South are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. I'll read it again. People in the South, they are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. And I'm fascinated by the notion of being released from history. What does that mean? Like, there are ways to be trapped in the past, I think. And this book that I wrote isn't like sad porn. Just you read this just to get trapped in the past, right? Or to drag yourself down into the doldrums. I think there are two ways to be trapped in the past, right? There is a way to be trapped in the past where you don't know the past, and thus you are oblivious to the currents of history that are passing through your life all the time. That's one way to be trapped in the past, by ignorance. The other way, I think, is through obsession, which is to be trapped in the past, to know your past so well that you think it is literally happening to you as an echo all of the time. That there's not evolution, that there's not new change, that there's not other things happening. And so the point in my telling of the upstairs lounge story, I hope, is to help people feel by educating themselves on this event, by understanding the place of queer citizens in our very recent past, actually, the place of marginalizations, that we could help to release both ourselves and future generations from those injustices. And that's a long introduction. I can gab for a long time about this because I'm super passionate about it. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a series of connected sections of Tinderbox. Two are going to deal with the legacy, which is kind of like a wrapper of this event. And the legacy of the event, really, of the upstairs lounge, was only the reason we're talking about this here and now. Any scholarship was really born out of the 1990s, out of an event that happened in 1995 on State Rock in New Orleans, and I'll take you into the scene of that event. And then there's going to be three scenes on the pivotal day in the history of the upstairs lounge fire on June 24th, 1973, wrapped around the event of the fire itself. I don't read the fire scene. I've never read it, actually. I feel like that's something someone should experience personally and individually if they choose to. I don't want someone, I don't give trigger warnings, but if someone's sitting in a reading, I feel like they should have the opportunity to not experience the intensity of that sequence in case if they've ever experienced something similar. But I'm going to take you up to the before, and I'll take you in the aftermath. And those scenes are evocative enough that I think you'll be able to understand the thrust and the gist of this event that was consequential and important, though for years, survivors were told that it wasn't, that their stories didn't matter, that they should just forget about it, and that any of their sadness and trauma had nothing to do with their being gay, interestingly enough. So I'm going to take you into the first scene, which took place on June 24th, 1995. And this took place at the MCC Church off St. Roch, in like closer to the Murray Street or St. Claude, in New Orleans. And this was the scene that birthed the Upstairs Lounge legacy. A gay-friendly church called the Metropolitan Community Church of New Orleans, which still existed and had a branch in 1973, a branch that lasted even through the AIDS crisis up into the mid-90s, decided that they'd had enough with the Upstairs Lounge legacy not being known, and that they were going to own their unique place and their unique relationship to this history. And the minister at that time, a gay man named Dexter Brecht, decided to personally preach a sermon about the Upstairs Lounge tragedy, and he didn't know what was going to happen or if his congregation was going to turn on him. So controversial, so unspeakable was the event still considered in the 1990s. All right, and I'll also place this in a bit of historical context. For the young uns, I don't know, like I'm not looking at everyone here, but for the young uns, okay, so 1995 is still at the end of criminalization of queer life. So you have Lawrence v. Texas, which was the Supreme Court decision that struck down anti-sodomy laws in states, had not occurred. That was 2003. So you state by state, there were still various laws that would affect an individual who lived any sort of queer existence, and you could be subject to employment discrimination. You could be harassed by officials. You could be harassed and arrested in your own home for private bedroom behavior, depending on the state, etc. So we're at the tail end of that era, is 1995, which is during the Clinton administration, during the era of something in the military called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," which was in the military, if you weren't allowed to, supposedly, you're supposed to protect queer people who were closeted in the military, where if you didn't ask someone, you weren't allowed to ask someone if they were gay or lesbian, and they weren't allowed to tell you. However, people were still being purged from the military hypocritically en masse. So that was sort of the cultural morass that was going on at that time period. Really no cultural figures other than Elton John are out publicly unless they'd outed themselves in the midst of the AIDS crisis and passed away. Usually someone who is dying of AIDS would at some point symbolically, like such as Freddie Mercury, announce their homosexuality a day before their death. That was typical. It was very rare actually that someone would announce their queerness and be living at this time. So that was still the cultural atmosphere and some of the controversy that would come into this gay Christian sermon about the Upstairs Lounge that I'm going to read from you, that took place in New Orleans off St. Roch, June 24th, 1995. There was a fire, the gay minister Dexter Brecht began. It was a fire so horrific that Courtney Craighead, the church's deacon who was standing nearby, couldn't even speak about his memories of the event. It was a fire set intentionally on June 24th, 1973, resulting in the death of 1/3 of the MCC congregation in New Orleans at that time. This fire, which had happened 22 years and one day before at a hangout called the Upstairs Lounge, remained so disturbing a memory that it never existed in the pages of American history. This tragedy, congregants knew, was in fact the only reason that the Times-Picayune had opted to send a reporter to hear their minister that day. We gather here this morning to remember, Dexter Brecht continued, remembering, whether we like it or not, is part of the human condition. It is good as a way of acknowledging our grief. It was a horrific scene to relate, a fire in a busy bar on the fringe of New Orleans' famous French Quarter that was set with lighter fluid. On that evening, flames had invented a sanctuary for blue-collar gay men. The fast-moving blaze overtook the second-floor bar with deep ties to the MCC faithful. But the destruction would extend well beyond church membership, claiming the lives of 31 men and 1 woman. Although it raged out of control for less than 20 minutes, the blaze left a fallout that shocked Carl Rabin, the coroner, who would struggle to identify the bodies using jewelry and hotel room keys. Fingers and faces and bones were scorched beyond recognition. Quote, they were just piled up, he said. Quote, people in a mass. One falls, then another falls. It's just a mass of death. It's sickening.
Then the story went silent. After a mere blip of coverage, it fell off the front pages of newspapers and then from interior pages entirely. Local and national television channels would dedicate just a few minutes of on-the-scene coverage to the upstairs lounge, in which survivors were interviewed with cameras to their backs due to reporters' fear of legitimizing the gay lifestyle and victims' fear of outing themselves to the public. Yet, in fact, the tragedy had affected nearly every segment of New Orleans' closeted gay community, estimated a month later by the local Gay People's Coalition to be around 60,000 of the city's then 600,000 residents, 10%. Most of the dead at the upstairs lounge, educated and illiterate, young and old, white and black, including a hustler, a minister, and a dentist, perished within the fire's first 360 seconds. The upstairs lounge, Dexter Brecht related to his flock, represented a moment that exposed a majority of citizens as at best apathetic towards homosexuals, while also revealing that civil rights movements in the era were tone deaf to homosexual plight. Indeed, civil rights and feminist constituencies in the 1970s did not leap to the defense of the upstairs lounge victims. The tragedy was not noted in Distaff, New Orleans' famous feminist alt magazine. It was a time when lesbians themselves were marginalized from quote unquote mainstream feminists, nor was there any mention in iconic Black newspapers like the Chicago Daily Defender, despite there being a Black upstairs lounge victim. This fire was a Holocaust, Dexter Brecht intoned, perhaps not in the millions like in the 40s, but surely just as devastating to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, end quote. The immediate aftermath of this blaze, occurring on the last day of celebrations marking the 4th anniversary of the 1969 Stonewall riots, became a chilling moment of loss for those gay Americans who actually heard the story, who were long conditioned to the reality that their sorrows were quarantined from the heterosexual American dream. In a cartoon in the August 1973 issue of The Advocate, which was then a somewhat ragtag alternative newspaper, a man in a hospital bed was bandaged up like a mummy. In the background, his chart read, "Upstairs bar fire, victim." With its physical and emotional toll, the upstairs lounge fire in New Orleans sat in stark contrast to the legendary riot that had taken place outside of the Stonewall Inn in New York City on June 28, 1969. On that day, homosexuals, transsexuals, and street kids had joined forces to resist New York Police Department officers who were raiding a gay bar and arresting the patrons. This act of defiance had become a wellspring for gay political recruitment. Standing in oblique shadow of the Stonewall riots, the upstairs lounge fire would be a major test for a movement called Gay Liberation, which sprang out of the Stonewall riots. Could this movement steward its people through a crisis? Would gay people recognize its right to lead? Yet, as Dexter Brecht spoke 22 years later to his flock in New Orleans, the upstairs lounge fire remained forgotten. So that's the first section, the beginning of the legacy of the firewall. We're just how we're even able to talk about this unspeakable event that was censored, buried in the 70s after it happened. And now we're going to dive into criminalization, into the past, into the significant day, June 24th, 1973. And we're going to meet the individual that Courtney was talking about, whom she was a protege of, Stuart Butler, the upstairs lounge patron, survivor, and later on, a very important queer activist. But Stuart on that day was just a 42-year-old bon vivant. All right, he hadn't engaged politically at this point. Keeping body and soul together while partying was his idea of living a well-lived life as a gay American. He existed apolitically within New Orleans' live and let live subculture that allowed vice takers to all live side by side each other so long as they didn't raise a stink
that caused a public kerfuffle and brought on the police and violent responses from authorities. So this is Stuart Butler in the daytime day drinking on June 24th, 1973, along Bourbon Street at various points. And we're gonna be seeing Stuart as he works his way towards the upstairs lounge that Sunday night. The French Quarter was a beehive of merriment that hazy evening, and Stuart Butler socialized well in his element. Bourbon Street was a notorious bazaar of buskers and hustlers, peddlers and mendicants, an avenue that could hardly be imagined beneath America's so-called Bible Belt. Most tourists kept to a tamer strip of bars located closer to downtown hotels. But a certain cadre of men dared further, strolling past the invisible line at the intersection of Bourbon and St. Anne streets. If you passed St. Anne, you would inevitably find a cloister of exotic establishments like Pete's Place or Caverns or Café Lafitte in Exile, where Stuart was currently imbibing. St. Anne Street was one of the many markers for gay men whose tastes ran towards the unconventional. Every year, Carnival season brought money and majesty into the city, in addition to over-the-top galas and crews, those private fraternal orders that sponsored nearby parades and crowned kings and queens of Mardi Gras. Many crews at the time were only beginning to racially integrate in 1973. Yet, from the 12th night after Christmas to Fat Tuesday in February, New Orleans would be consumed and the gay community subsumed in a dream state of masks and feathers and beads and anything goes. For many celebrants, Mardi Gras signified not a pantomime, but a culmination of real life. And the French Quarter, especially the gay French Quarter, seemed to savor in this fantasia. The nation's oldest annual gay event, the Fat Monday Luncheon Club, had begun in the Quarter in 1969, while the crew of Yuga, New Orleans' first gay carnival club, its initials KY, a sly reference to the popular sexual lubricant of the era, debuted in 1958. And a young Stuart Butler, in town with his family, remembered attending his first Mardi Gras with awe and becoming aroused at the sight of the flambeaux or mirrored torches paraded by crews of muscular Black men. Such was the spell of the season. By 1972, New Orleans had 6 gay crews hosting ticketed ball for private members, with discretion, of course, assured, and requests for, quote, no pictures, please. The exhilaration of Carnival with its masked tradition facilitated the unmasking of otherwise captive aspects of the self, which called into question which was the truer mask, the pious man or the partier. Alas, the dream of Mardi Gras was fleeting and ended always, especially for Stuart. Ash Wednesday stood as a Catholic roadblock to cut the fun short before Easter Sunday. Bourbon Street attempted to keep a small share of this merriment going year-round, although not always succeeding. Today, in late June, fun was achieved through the bonhomie of Stuart Butler. Stuart held forth at Café Lafitte in Exile, with twin bombshells on his arms, 20-year-old Stephen Duplantis, Stuart's Guy Friday, and 30-something baby doll Alfred Doolittle, Stuart's steady boyfriend. Stuart had met and bedded Stephen Duplantis first when Stephen was 18 and he drove from Lake Charles to New Orleans for the first time. This was Mardi Gras 1971. Stuart happened to be left alone at the end of a night, bereft of companionship, down to his last $2 at Café Lafitte in Exile, and he bought a final drink and resolved to spend the rest of the night in a stinking hot tent on the river. You could do that then, evidently. Just then, Stuart Butler, sitting in the back corner of the bar, persuaded a friend to taunt Stephen by extinguishing a cigarette in the teen's drink. When Stuart's friend did so, Stephen became understandably enraged, and the situation escalated. Quote, well, here comes Butler to save the day, remembers Stephen Duplantis. He says, Stuart says to Stephen, oh, I tell you what, why don't you come back to the house and we'll smoke a joint and I'll fix you up all the cocktails you want. And Stephen said, oh, thank you, God. God, I love that in line. In their thruplehood, as one could say it,
Stuart continued his work in New Orleans as a draftsman at an engineering firm, although where he wasn't open about his sexuality, while Stephen served in the Air Force and Alfred Doolittle seemed to occupy his time decorating their apartment and cheerfully writing letters to world leaders. The relationship of Stephen, Stuart, and Alfred had deepened into a genuine menage a trois by the summer of 1973, and the trio would sleep in the same bed on weekends when Stephen visited. And they seemed to be having a proverbial ball that Sunday. Stephen's small bouts of silence and brooding notwithstanding, Stephen would soon have to leave for his drink for his long back drive to his Air Force base in Texas, but Stuart suggested that they stop at the upstairs lounge for one last drink. Next section, Twilight, June 24th, 1973. This is the upstairs lounge. Okay, so this is gonna be the atmosphere of a working class gay oasis that's secretive. Imagine a bar that was so big it could fit about 100 people, but walking past it, because it was on the second story, you wouldn't even know it existed there. A place that barely advertised itself, that was only accessible by a twisting staircase that you wouldn't even know to go up. It didn't look remarkable at all. Then you would reach this nondescript metal door, knock, and open, and you would enter this oasis gay establishment, the upstairs lounge. So this is where Stuart and Stephen and Alfred are gonna be on the night of June 24th, 1973. And I'll take you into some of the upstairs lounge culture, this was their favorite gay bar in the underground queer subculture of the French Quarter in the 1970s. A gay man named Adam Fontenot was visibly sauced. Having imbibed hard liquor for more than 5 hours without a bite to eat, Adam took on the role of the resident lush at the upstairs lounge. He was, witnesses recall, able to giggle and nod in agreement with the speaker's words, but unable to participate more in the conversation. Nor did his compromised balance enable him to stand or move much from his bar stool. The bartender, Buddy Rasmussen, was busy, if also slightly annoyed with this man, his lover. Buddy was accustomed to seeing Adam in such a stupor, but he also felt partially responsible for serving him too many drinks this afternoon. Buddy and his busboy, Rusty Quinton, had their hands full tending to the crowds, facing the ceaseless call for pitchers and mugs at the upstairs lounge, and they soon forgot about Adam. The beer bust, the drink special, was in full swing, with 90 or so gay patrons laughing and carousing on a carefree Sunday evening. Some patrons needed babysitting more than others. Plus, those not satisfied by bottomless beer were placing drink orders that needed to be filled. During hectic hours at the upstairs lounge, one had to shout drink orders at the bartender Buddy, and they needed to be simple. Anything beyond a rum and coke, a Bloody Mary, or a Cape Cod, vodka, cranberry juice, lime juice would be laughed away. Nursing a drink, Stephen Duplantis ran his eyes over the bodies around him, looking for a new squeeze. Prospects abounded, many in a condition that made them amenable to a pickup line. Stephen tended to drink straight rum, as did many in the armed forces in that era. Stuart and Alfred drank whatever and whenever the fancy struck them, but they usually sprang for vodka. Above their heads at the upstairs lounge, a haze of cigarette smoke hung in bilious clouds that wafted just below the ceiling tiles. Window units pulsed with air conditioning, and the bartender Buddy tried to preserve the coolness by shouting, "Close the door," whenever patrons entered. Coins jangled in pockets or rolled across the bar, as many paid for the beer bust, the drink special at that bar, in change. It felt like everyone was at the upstairs lounge tonight. Robert Van Langendonk, a newbie, wore gold-rimmed glasses and introduced himself warily as Bob Van. Maybe he was closeted, some guess. He used the nickname to protect a corporate job at Shell Oil. Van Langendonk's friend Jim Hambrick, a toupee-wearing regular, looked more than a few decades Robert's senior, and he'd provided a ride to the French Quarter, and he was ordering their drinks. Seeing a crowd form at the bar, Hugh Cooley, the busboy, agreed to pitch in a few hours early as a second busboy for Buddy. The MCC crew of New Orleans, the gay Christians, arrived in trickles. Deacon Courtney Craighead around 5 p.m., Deacon Mitch Mitchell with Horace Broussard, his lover, after they dropped off their kids at the movies, actually at the Britannia Theater. And Pastor Bill Larson of the MCC of New Orleans Church arrived with the rest of his friends who just dined at a place called the Fatted Calf. Witnesses recalled how they all looked primed for fun. Ricky Everett, a common upstairs lounge patron, snagged a table in the dance area with an out-of-towner named Ronnie Rosenthal so that they could talk with fewer interruptions. In an era when televisions had fewer than 8 channels, bars were forums where people commonly struck up banter easily with strangers. Quote, "I just never could sit in a bar," explained Ricky. "I was too hyper. I would have a cocktail, and if I was not having a conversation, I'd just drift off to another bar. Bartenders would often serve as conduits by making quick introductions. Ricky called Buddy Rasmussen at the upstairs lounge a renowned promoter of dialogue, capable of juggling multiple exchanges and a telephone conversation, actually, at once. Buddy's talents worked to patrons like Ricky's advantage. Ricky's mother, who lived across the river in Gretna, was known to call the upstairs lounge with messages for her closeted son. As a self-confessed mama's boy, Ricky was still in and out of the family home as a tenant, and his mother insisted that Ricky give her a place to call when he was out in case of emergencies. Despite all the shenanigans surrounding him at the bar, Buddy was known to play it cool when the phone rang. He kept people's cover. One time when Ricky was out bar hopping in the French Quarter, Ricky felt a tug on the shoulder from a cute stranger just over from the upstairs lounge who leaned in and whispered a message from Buddy Rasmussen. "Call your mama, Ricky." Today, Ricky relaxed in a nook with Ronnie. Closer to the bar, a man named Luther Boggs leaned on Jean Gosnell, his best friend and occasional beard, a female companion used as a ruse to conceal one's homosexual lifestyle at the time. They sat near the couple Reggie Adams and Regina Saleto and the inebriated Adam Fontenot. Perry Waters, a gay dentist, joked with the group. Was that sweet-voiced Francis Dufresne in from Harahan? Dufresne was known to catch 2 buses from the suburbs to reach the bar. He lived for these nights at the upstairs lounge. And there was Willie Inez Warren, a gay mother hen with her 2 quote-unquote gay-for-pay sons, the part-time hustlers Eddie and James. They were considered shabby but honest folk, always off-duty at the upstairs lounge. Worlds inevitably intermixed here. Stuart Butler chatted with Horace Broussard, deacon of the MCC, Mitchell's lover, and Stuart's regular barber. That's where I'd make a barber appointment, recalled Stuart. I just made an appointment with him that night. Jason Guidry, sometimes called the upstairs lounge's bar dingbat, was present as well. The place seemed to actually darken a bit toward the grand piano in the corner, which was lit up to provide a stage for performers. Some of the windows on the Charter Street side of the upstairs lounge were shuttered to accentuate the feeling of privacy. Patrons like John Golding, who'd recently celebrated 25 years of marriage to his wife, appreciated those precautions. John had much to lose by drinking at the upstairs lounge that night. He was a prototypical blue-collar breadwinner, working as a salesman at a cigar shop and living with his family near the Lower Garden District. For decades, John and his wife, Jane, had an understanding. She didn't venture with him downtown, and he didn't let his fun creep back into their marriage. Quote, "She clearly accepted Dad for who he was," explained their son, John Golding Jr., who was 11 years old in 1973. Quote, "Yes, there was this void of homosexuality linked to Dad. That was always there, but Mom was accepting of it and clearly very attached to him. They shared a bed. It wasn't just a black and white, it was all deception dynamic. Although their arrangement was loving, it wasn't ideal. Months before, John had been fired from his well-paying job at a public utility after being caught in a homosexual act. Patrons at the upstairs lounge, like John, wished, beyond all else, to avoid public declarations of their lifestyle. Individuals caught by the police and charged with offenses would be outed when their names were routinely published in the Orleans Parish Record of the day. a popular crime blotter section of the Times-Picayune. In this police record, names would be listed besides alleged crimes and alleged attempted crimes. Indeed, according to Louisiana's criminal code, an attempted crime against nature could be prosecuted. A gay man didn't actually need to commit a homosexual offense to face a penalty. Conspiracy or intent to commit could be sufficient if proven. The state's sodomy law, ostensibly on the books to prosecute any type of non-marital sex, from adultery to bestiality, was most often employed to prosecute same-gender sex, and at one time prescribed a mandatory penalty of life imprisonment with hard labor for a single offense. By 1973, the charge had been reduced to a felony with a minimum 2 years in prison. And even in the event that a charge was dropped due to a lack of evidence, one's name would often still appear printed in the newspaper besides the annotation "Noel Prost," meaning not prosecuted. Quote, "That pretty much ended your life in New Orleans," recalled John Myers, a gay Catholic seminarian who lived near and sometimes attended the upstairs lounge. These were the stakes, pressing in from the outside world. But all seemed different inside the upstairs lounge, as if freedom reigned to the tune of David Stewart Gary's playing at the piano. All right, so this is later. This next scene is later on that night. Dusk, June 24th, 1973. The upstairs lounge fire has occurred. In a matter of minutes, people's lives have been cleaved in two. Imagine standing in a place and having one choice to make in 30 seconds. Which way do I run? And that choice determining your life or your death at a bar that had only had, according to the public, one entrance, that twisting stairwell from the street. And you have a choice when fire enters the room, as if shot from a flamethrower. Do I turn left or do I turn right? Those who turned right ended up following the bartender Buddy Rasmussen to a secret, unmarked emergency exit that safely took them to a neighboring rooftop, then down the stairs to the street. Those who turned left and wanted to run as far away from the flames as they could found themselves penned in by in the equivalent of a brick furnace at the edge of the bar, and they perished in a pile. They tried to crack through the windows at that time, and when they tried to crack through the windows and break the glass, what they found were iron bars installed as a supposed safety measure, blocking their path and blocking their escape. Their oasis in that moment became a prison, and their lives were engulfed en masse. So this is as the upstairs lounge fire is raging. I'm not reading the fire scene itself, but this is Dusk. Chapter 5 is Mayhem, I call it. June 24th, 1973. The upstairs lounge fire is ongoing. People are dying as the scene is going on, but this is from the perspective of Stuart Butler, who had left the bar by chance, by luck, about 7 minutes before the fire began. So about 7:45 p.m. that night, when the fire entered, was started in the front staircase with the aid of lighter fluid around 7:52 to 7:53 p.m. So by chance, he was down the street at another bar, and now he's reacting to what he hears about a kerfuffle happening down the street on Iberville at the upstairs lounge, at the corner of Iberville and Charters. Up Iberville Street at the next corner, Royal Street, Stuart Butler and Alfred Doolittle drank and caroused at Wanda's, a Gene Davis-owned hustler bar and dive. Their tempers had cooled after Stuart's little flare-up with Alfred on the upstairs lounge staircase. Stuart hadn't wanted to leave the bar, and they were back to being relaxed in each other's company. More drinks, of course, helped to pacify the rage. Sirens blared a few blocks away, but Stuart thought nothing of them at first. Alfred was in good spirits, seemingly pleased that Stuart had finally listened to his entreaties to leave the bar. Sounds of alarm grew, though, interrupting their conversation as a red fire truck sped within feet of Stuart and Alfred, the engine from the central fire station screeching as it plowed a taxi aside to reach down the one-way of Iberville. Down at the next intersection, nearer to the scene of horror, a district chief of the fire department waved the engine forward. Metal scraped metal as the truck smashed yet another car to the curb and rushed towards the upstairs lounge in a blur. Something horrific clicked in Stuart Butler's head, a realization overriding the warm buzz of booze. Alfred, his boyfriend, crazy fucking Alfred, had been right about leaving. Quote, Alfred didn't, but I went out there on the street, required Stuart. He walked towards his favorite saloon, which he had only left minutes before. Quote, I kind of approached it gradually, he recalled, and all of this suddenly. As Stuart headed towards the lounge, a man named Roger Nunez, a hustler, passed and entered Wanda's from the direction of the Walgreens, which is actually still there on Royal in Iberville. Roger made a strange announcement in the bar called Wanda's. Thank God, I just made it from the fire. His blackened appearance, covered in what looked to be soot, lightly provoked this declaration, a means to explain his outward condition and win sympathy from fellow patrons who might otherwise regard him strangely. Roger kept repeating these words as he wandered into and out of Wanda's to peer down what was happening at Iberville. When someone later asked how he escaped that burning bar, Roger explained that he, quote, got out the back exit door, perhaps wagering that no Wanda's patron could discern how his previous front door ejection by Buddy Rasmussen made this means of egress from the upstairs lounge impossible for him. Clearly, Roger's story was evolving with the scene down the way. A smell like charcoal increased as Stuart Butler neared the flashing lights. The walk, 145 steps from Wanda's, took him less than 2 minutes. What Stuart encountered looked like a war zone. The street reflected a blowout of an explosion. Fires leapt from windows and smoke wafted out off bodies, with friends pointing and officials yelling. Everything seemed to shout for Stuart's attention. Few details connected or made sense. Fire engines stretched from street to sidewalk, which was littered with bits of glass, flakes of ash, pieces of acrid flesh, and pools of human fluid. Drunken sightseers ambled forth curiously between the casualties as firemen and policemen tried to hold them back. Indeed, a virtual cross-section of New Orleans society coalesced on Iberville Street, hugging the sides of the road. Guests exited from 2 pornographic movie houses near the burning bar. They coalesced with businessmen wandering from the Marriott's Levy Bar or sauntering from the upscale Hotel Monteleone. Gripped by the flames, their eyes reflected a mixture of horror and fascination. Cinders fluttered like bright moths, threatening to light the entire French Quarter. Firefighters aimed a hose into a window, while others chased and tackled a man trailing smoke signals, hands slapping flames on his head, red running down from the burn. Upstairs lounge fire survivor Courtney Craighead and Ricky Everett struggled to breathe beside policemen as Rusty Critton, the busboy, cried repeatedly, "My friends, my friends." Strangers echoed names of people trapped upstairs. Some cries they tried to persuade themselves answered in response. A man named Milton Mary, who'd been passing by, scooped water from a gutter and ladled it onto a suit-covered figure who lay face down with a gash on his head. Grabbing a fireman, Mary asked, "Can you put some water on this man?" The fireman answered, "He's gone," even though the man, most likely upstairs lounge patron Jim Hambrick, was not actually dead, but in a state of catatonic shock. He would later be discovered alive and rushed to Charity Hospital. Regina Saleto, an upstairs lounge patron who'd left about 20 minutes before, came back bearing a checkbook and a hat borrowed from her friend Jean Goswell, and she wandered back from that errand towards the upstairs lounge. Minutes before, she'd left her lover Reggie at the grand piano close to Adam Fontenot and the MCC pastor Bill Larson. Moving through rescue workers, she heard a distant yelling that she soon realized was the sound of her own screaming voice. Regina kept thinking she saw Reggie in the crowd, but each time it would only be a stranger's face. She saw what looked to be an air conditioner detonate and fly from an upstairs window in the building. A silver ladder stretched toward her friend Jean, who was up on a fire escape on the 3rd floor. A white-helmeted man yelled for her to reach down farther. Grabbing the handles with singed fingers, Gosnell ran down the makeshift stairs, which bounced in the air and met the fireman halfway. Upstairs lounge bartender Buddy Rasmussen stomped about the street angrily as if he were looking for some culprit. He ran into Bill Duncan, a fellow upstairs lounge regular and close friend, and the two hugged in silence. From his nearby apartment, Duncan had heard yells and ran outside. Thank God, Buddy said, not having known if Duncan had perished in the bedlam above. Closer to the parking lot, Francis Duvernay sat stunned on a curb. Other survivors like Robert Van Langendonk deputized themselves as medic. Somewhere down this Charter Street, an ambulance peeled off. Firemen dragged those survivors who'd fallen from the windows and lacked the strength to move another inch. Quote, the guy's skin stuck to the fireman's hand, recalled a witness of one victim. Survivor Philip Bird was physically thrown into an ambulance where a man on a gurney begged him to remove his scalding clothing. Philip Bird burned his hands trying to do so. The rags were hot enough to cauterize flesh. In a helpless moment when the vehicle had accelerated, Philip Bird realized that he had defecated in his pants. When Stuart Butler turned right onto Charter Street, he saw something heartrending. Quote, it was Bill Larson's corpse, recalled Stuart, who noticed the green fabric of Larson's shirt clinging to pink flesh. Stuart gagged and cried for this man who he'd sat beside at the same time. That's the scene of devastation following the upstairs lounge, the scene that many said was inconsequential for several decades. Stuart Butler would actually be forced, because he was closeted at work, to go the next day and pretend that he didn't know anything that had happened at the bar and that he didn't know anyone who died there. And that affected him for the rest of his life, and eventually became a motivating factor that brought him into a life in politics and a life of queer activism and a life of outness. The upstairs lounge was his motivating moment with what he experienced on the street that day. So I'm going to wrap this all up, because that's a horrific scene I've just related to you, with the a final scene about the upstairs lounge legacy. This scene took place on June 24th, 2003, the 25th anniversary of the upstairs lounge tragedy, where something remarkable occurred that from which you can post-date all upstairs lounge scholarship, my book included, and a documentary. There's a few musicals now about the upstairs lounge tragedy. There's plays, etc. But it all sort of spurred from this important moment that I'm gonna read to you now, which took place in 2003, actually in June, at a memorial service observance held at the Ritz-Carlton, New Orleans, in honor and recognition of the upstairs lounge tragedy that had taken place in the city. And this is the city attempting to own its history and finally doing so successfully. A sizable crowd buzzed in the reception hall of the Ritz-Carlton, New Orleans on June 22nd, 2003. The gay minister, Reverend Dexter Brecht, his short-cropped hair reflecting the heartache of a long, long struggle, seemed to radiate in their presence. Stuart Butler nodded at him from a back seat. Former fire chief from 1973, William McCrossan, sat nearby as an honored guest. His mere presence moved many, it did Stuart, as if the 89-year-old ex-fireman was making not just a personal statement, but also an act of atonement on behalf of city leaders from the 1970s. Guests, Reverend Troy Perry and Reverend Bill Richardman, the long-retired New Orleans minister of St. George's Episcopal Church, also stood at the ready to preach. Gazing at the faces in the Ritz-Carlton, Dexter Brecht and Bill Richardson felt vindicated that the upstairs lounge had begun to matter to others. Fire survivor Ricky Everett, nonetheless, was absent from these affairs. He still struggled with the onslaughts of memory and therefore stayed far away from events like this one. Former Upstairs Lounge patron Henry Kubicki lived in town and wanted to attend, but couldn't, having contended with too much woe as a caregiver for Upstairs Lounge survivors like Courtney Craighead, as well as for dying friends during the AIDS crisis. Returning to the MCC of New Orleans and this event, Henry knew, would bring back too many faces from the past. Reverend Dexter Brecht began the service by evoking the dark times. The crowd recited a responsorial psalm, "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast." Troy Perry, deferring to Dexter Brecht, told the story of the crisis week following the Upstairs Lounge fire in 1973 in his eulogy. And as a response, the crowd said a hymn, quote, "We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. At the culmination of the service, an Upstairs Lounge survivor, Deacon Courtney Craighead, led participants outside towards the historic fire site. Others followed, single file. Deacon Courtney Craighead's transformation, epitomized by this act, moved the gay minister Dexter Brecht deeply, and that he was, quote, there as a representative of folks that had actually been through it, a role that the deacon had once been reluctant to assume. Stuart Butler let his imagination wander as he headed with Courtney and others through the Vieux Carré, which seemed to yield to their shared grief. Puffs of flower and fern and the breath of banana trees from secret gardens and inner courtyards hidden between buildings wafted through passageways. Stuart could never forget that Sunday evening in 1973, walking down those steps, down Iberville to the Inferno. Everyone, it seemed, avoided the side of the Upstairs Lounge after a few days. Not a single city official attended either of the two memorial services, Stuart recalled it all. Now, the New Orleans Police Department, the institution that never named or charged a culprit, was a corporate sponsor for Upstairs Lounge memorial events. The gay minister Dexter Brecht marshaled his emotions when they all reached the significant location, an unmarked door near the corner where a small wedge of sidewalk lay beneath a flapping white sheet. Quote, we were not supposed to be blocking the street, Dexter Brecht recalled, but we did spill out into the street at that point. Dexter Brecht lifted the veil to reveal gleaming bronze embedded in the sidewalk brick. Upon this plaque, shown 32 names held together by an upside down triangle and set between two fleur-de-lis with these words, at this site, on June 24th, 1973 in New Orleans, these 32 people lost their lives in the worst fire in New Orleans history. The impact went far beyond the loss of individual lives, giving birth to the lesbian, gay, transgender and bisexual rights movement in New Orleans. Looking at the marker there, the monument, Dexter Brecht had to catch his breath. To actually see the plaque, he recalled, to see it there. Brecht sprinkled holy water on the metal surface, just as he did well-wishers tossed yellow chrysanthemums, and someone read out the names. This was our birthing process, Dexter Brecht told the crowd. This was where we really became a people. With this dedication, the Upstairs Lounge achieved new status. The fire became one of the first historically significant events in the gay rights movement, the other being the Stonewall riots, to receive a permanent monument in a public place by 2003. It had truly become a living memorial, etched into the fabric of New Orleans. It somehow refused to die almost, Dexter Brecht recalled. The plaque itself weighed several hundred pounds. Its dimensions were 30 inches by 30 inches. Pouring the bronze had cost about $2,200, with the materials and labor to install it in the sidewalk totaling a few thousand extra. Yet this marker had taken 3 decades to appear. This monument held unique meaning for the MCC of New Orleans Church, which still existed, for families of the Upstairs Lounge victims denied dignity and restitution, for those fire survivors lost to the subsequent AIDS epidemic, and for those inside the bar who would become memories in ashes. It meant a great deal that the plaque could transmute what had once been an historic abyss for the city, a source of unspeakable pain, into a story that others could remember. I'm going to end it there because I don't think I can read it anymore, to be honest. But that's the story of the plaque, the upstairs lounge monument being laid. I said it was the 25th. It was actually the 30th anniversary of the upstairs lounge tragedy in 2003, and the long effort from 1995 through 2003, 8 years that this gay minister of New Orleans, Dexter Brecht, fought often alone to lay the permanent plaque at the site, which is still there to this day. It's very beautiful. Obviously, the corner of Iberville and Chartres has changed a bit in its character. It's not quite as seedy as it was in 1973, that area. So I pass by on my morning drives to get my coffee at French Truck, which is actually located on Chartres now. And the only reason I'm telling you is as I pass by, I always look left in the morning, and I inevitably see a new pair of people reading the plaque. And I know that they are experiencing what I experienced in terms of discovering this fire for the first time. They're being enlightened and educated and changed in the way that I think this story, this very messy story, can change people. And that is what I think is the driving purpose and resounding point of the upstairs lounge tragedy, which I think is a transformative event. And that's my little reading for tonight. If anyone has any questions, I've gone a long time, but I'm happy to speak some more, or we could call it if I've exhausted all of you. So I don't know where you're at. So let me know.
Could you talk more about that, the first moment where you felt inspired to write this book when you read that plaque?
Yeah, so it was 2014. I had just had a conversation with like a professor at my journalism school in New York who lived in New Orleans in 1973 and been a baby reporter in the French Quarter when the fire happened, actually. And so I'd always been looking for an excuse to come to New Orleans. Like I was like a teenage kid that was like obsessed with Anne Rice, and in college, like my first boyfriend and I read Christopher Rice because it was like that. Like A Density of Souls was like so hot at the time, like the words just dripped from the pages. It was like almost erotica. Anyway, so I loved A Confederacy of Dunces. I was like looking for, in my whole life, some reason to come to New Orleans, some driving story I could become obsessed with, and I never found it. And then suddenly this professor told me about this terrible, tragic event, the deadliest fire in record in city history, and he couldn't explain much more about it. He was too hazy, couldn't say why. I don't know, maybe something happened. And I was like, oh, this was the first instance where this professor I was talking to seemed befuddled or confounded in any of his memories. And I was like, I think something happened traumatic to the city at that point, which must have caused a collective amnesia, not just for him, but for everyone involved. So I flew. I only knew two people in town. They lived in Carrollton, and I stayed in their wisteria-scented sunroom on like free or reduced rent. The whole time I was researching this book. Like this book is like, they're mentioned in the acknowledgements because honestly, they were true patrons of the arts. But like, but so I remember walking up, I asked a couple people as I was nearing the French Quarter for the first time. I took the St. Charles streetcar to Bourbon Carondelet then leads into Bourbon. I walked over to Bourbon and then I turned right. I was walking down. I remember I read a little bit about the Walgreens being significant as the place where the suspected arsonist may have purchased the lighter fluid. And I was shocked to see this Walgreens on the corner of Iberville and Chartres Street. As I got closer, it got eerier up to the point that I walked up and I walked over the plaque. It's just in the ground. It's 32. It's not very big. I didn't know what I was looking for. And it's by a side door. You could easily pass by this monument. And then I sort of retraced my steps back and I saw it, and it was in sad shape, to be honest. It had pieces of gum on it. It looked like someone had
extinguished a cigar on it recently. It looked like many queer monuments do, which it looked vandalized or neglected. And I read out the names for the first time of each of the upstairs lounge victims, and then the 3 unidentifieds. And I was transformed. I don't know what I bit obsessed. I don't know what. Like there was just at that point, nothing was going to stop me. I didn't even have a book contract at that point. Like I was just a guy pursuing a project. So, but nothing was going to stop me from exhausting all my resources to write a manuscript that I hope would eventually become a book. And then from there, I ended up, meeting. I tried to get, to meet individuals in New Orleans' current queer subculture. I started emailing people. Eventually, I met a guy named Frank Perez, who I call the dirty uncle of the French Quarter. He knows everybody, or some people call him French Quarter Frank. I also call him the gay Danny DeVito. Anyway, so those are my nicknames for him. But Frank said, I said, can you explain to me, I need I need a download of just queer New Orleans history. And he's like, yeah, come meet me. And I was like, where? I presumed he'd have an office or we'd meet at an archive. He's like, oh no, meet me in the back corner of Cafe Lafitte in Exile. I'm a barfly. So I walked from the upstairs lounge to Cafe Lafitte in Exile where he was day drinking, and we ordered High Lifes. And then I started recording it, and I got a download of queer New Orleans history. And he started introducing me to people, and it felt like I was being it was like what Evelyn Waugh talks about in Brideshead Revisited, and about finding the low door in a wall that leads through into all the gardens of Oxford, where all of a sudden I was being introduced to all these significant individuals in a queer New Orleans subculture. And then Frank was telling me all about queer New Orleans history, and then he was giving me out of his phone contacts to upstairs lounge survivors, my first survivors. And so the first survivor number I got was Stuart Butler. And I was so nervous to call him. I waited a few days. I felt so much of the weight of the history when I called him. I talked unintelligibly fast into his answering machine, and he couldn't make out my name or my number. And he tried and retried by replaying the message, but Stuart had a generous spirit, and he was also a determined and stubborn man. And so he called around town to ask about me, ended up calling Frank, and then Frank was able to backtrack to Stuart. And so the first upstairs lounge survivor I spoke to was this important queer activist who chided me for talking too fast on the phone. He actually played me my message, and I was like, you're right, I can't understand anything. I don't know what I was doing. And then he agreed to spend as much time as possible with me on this project. And Stuart possessed a generous spirit in that way. And we probably had more than 20 hours of conversation at his house, which is it's called the Fairy Playhouse, which is this unmistakable pink residence dotted with red hearts on Esplanade Avenue. And that was my sort of welcome into queer New Orleans society, and also into upstairs lounge history, and to the whole lot of it. And it changed and transformed my life. And I live here now. I fell in love with the city and I moved here. Anyway, that was a long answer, Sean, but that's how it all kind of happened. It was serendipity. I felt like I'm surfing the wave of things. That's sort of how it all worked. Anyone else have any other questions?
Hi, I just wanted to tell you, I bought your book. I guess maybe it might have been part of my pandemic reading. And your book just struck me so much because I grew up, I was a kid in the 70s, and my grandfather owned a barroom in the French Quarter. And what really amazed me was growing up, I never heard about this fire. It was definitely unheard of. And you'd think, because my grandfather had this bar, that I would have heard something about it as a kid, but I didn't. And so that really struck me. But hearing you read and just reading the book itself, this was such a powerful reading. And I can't even imagine, just kind of the emotions that you had when you were writing this book, and kind of, can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, how did you deal with your emotions while writing this book?
Well, not well, according to my husband. Like, no, no, how did I deal with them? I didn't understand. I spoke to several trauma reporters, or war zone reporters, actually, who I knew this book would involve me imagining myself into every corner of an upstairs lounge bar where terrible things were happening to people who I'd, through my reporting research, felt like I'd gotten to know. And that when I would write the scene, I knew it would feel like I was doing it to them, even though I wasn't. Once I got everyone in the significant room, at the significant place, at the significant time, I had this horrific moment where I was like, can I just let these people out? Like, and I guess that's fiction, right? Like, I can pick and choose then, and I could say, you could get out because I loved you so much. But I'm not writing that. I'm writing a historical account. And so I had to allow what was about to happen. I had to allow the fire to be lit in the stairwell, to proceed up the stairs, to allow up to the point where the bell starts ringing in the bar and the person opens the door. And it was terrible to write. I spent 3 months writing the fire scene. I cried and threw up writing it a lot. I'm being real with you. I'm not gonna, a lot. It was terrible. And I talked to war zone reporters about how do you report trauma and tragedy, and the most, or, thinking about the most awful things, seeing the most awful things in your mind. How do you deal with the nightmares? I was asking them about, and they were saying, they recommended what I ended up doing, which is I got a grief counselor. Like, there's a thing in reporting called, it's not real trauma. I wasn't at the event. The real trauma was people who lost loved ones, you know what I mean? Or people who were at the event itself. That's the worst degree of pain. I was experiencing what's called ancillary trauma, which happens where you place yourself, and this is something that physicians, psychologists, ministers, etc., people who take on some of that energy start to feel a little bit of the weight of it. And then it starts to affect them. So I started seeing a grief counselor to process, in some cases, the reality that I was grieving people that I was just sad I'd never met before. They seemed so remarkable. I never got to meet. They died. They were so remarkable to me, though. And it felt like at various points that that I got to know them in some way when I didn't. And then I felt sad that the artifice of it as well made me feel sad. So that was sort of how I did it. And then also I discovered a drink called the Sazerac in New Orleans. Is a strong cocktail, and that also buffered on certain nights, when used wisely, buffered some of the pain, some of the situation. Although writers and journalists need to be careful with the sauce. Anyone who's on the call, to be honest, it takes out as many people in our profession as it assists. So, but that was sort of how I went at it. And then also, like, part of my way of processing the story is continuing to talk about it in the way that several upstairs lounge survivors are that way too. Ricky Everett, who survived the night of the fire, continues to tell his story because that's part of his grieving process. And Henry Kubicki, who was a patron across the street at the Marriott, not actually in the fire himself, but lost friends in the fire, continues to talk about the story too. And I find that the act of sharing and the act of reaffirming the significance of an event allows me to process it and not become trapped in it, because it's awful. It's like a multi-stacked tragedy. And even now it's frustrating because I feel like, there are aspects of the tragedy that New Orleans still hasn't resolved. For example, there's still one identified and 3 unidentified victims in a remote potter's field in New Orleans East. And that's not getting solved by anyone right now. And I just have to acknowledge I am one person, and hopefully telling the story more and more will eventually create some sort of momentum. But yeah, I mean, this is that
I'm glad you asked that question, because I had to debate when this book first came out whether I was going to say that, because some people act like I just handle it, whatever, it all rolls out. No, it doesn't. It's like when you're doing it right as a narrative nonfiction writer and reporter, I'm trying to create a situation that feels emotionally consequential for the readers, and therefore I take on a lot of the emotions too. My brain is the crucible or the sieve that it passes through, and that creates a certain amount of friction and tension that has to be resolved somehow.
Thank you. That was, yeah. Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Bobby, if you could talk a little bit about, and I know we're getting late into the evening, but one of the things I really love about the book is this real narrative sense. Like it feels like it reads like fiction, like a fiction writer wrote it, as opposed to a journalist, right? It doesn't feel like it's at arm's length. You know, you feel engaged. You feel like this is like you're in it. Can you talk a little bit about your writing process and how you created that urgency, right? That feeling that we're right there, especially when you're recreating a lot of this in this kind of historical sense where you weren't.
Sure. I mean, that's just the kind of book I like when I'm reading history. I don't like dry history. Like I like you were there history with a lot of scenes. So I'm always looking for ways to create and reconstruct scenes based on evidence. And the way you do that is you amass a Venn diagram, you amass evidence like a greedy leprechaun with their gold pile. And then eventually like you look for overlapping evidence in like a Venn diagram. And then from there, if you have 2 or 3 sources saying something that points towards greater reliability, and you can eventually create it's the one leap that narrative nonfiction writers can do. But then I create a room, I place people in the room, I place things in the room that I know were there. I know that the wallpaper was red flocked. I know that the Burt Reynolds, I can close my eyes and picture the upstairs lounge room. I know where the Burt Reynolds poster is. I know where the jukebox is. I know where the cigarette machine is. I know where the bathroom is. I know where the fire escape is. I know where this is a Rite of Spring statue. Then you go drinks. Then it's a Farnese Hercules. Then it's the windows at the far end. And then I'm curving over now and there's the white baby grand piano. You eventually are able to do that where when you have enough material, you have fire maps, you have other things where it all sorts of, the brain's a weird thing creatively, but it starts to animate itself. And then from there, once you've done that kind of work, you're able to tell a scene is just a significant action that takes place in a location. And so once you have an accurate location, you can then utilizing other information, create the accurate, the significant action that takes place in the location. And that's, this is all like craft talk. I'm sorry if it's too like nuts and boring, but like nuts and bolts or whatever, but like, that's what I like. I like serious scene reconstruction. I like history because I feel like then that if you can place yourself or place the reader in the environment, then what happens to characters who readers have fallen in love with, who they've picked and choose, and they decide they like this one, they don't like this one, or what have you, then whatever happens to those individuals is emotionally consequential to them. And I wanted it to be emotionally consequential. I didn't want it to just feel like blurred, fire entered the room, and then 32 dead. Like I wanted people to understand on a second by second basis how fast fire moves through a place, the physics of fire and how it works, how terrifying it is, how fragile a human body is, and what happened as best as I could reconstruct to each person. Because for decades, people, authorities in New Orleans, powerful families, had emphasized time and again, tried to drum into people that nothing that happened in this room was significant, where I disagree. I think everything that happened in the room was significant.
Bobby, I just want to thank you, speaking to what you just shared a few minutes ago about the power of storytelling and being witnessed in community.
Yeah.
And that being both healing for you in the way that your brain has taken on the emotional quality of what you've spent so much time laboring into telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
I also, not a question, but just like on a personal note, like it's emotionally cathartic for me to hear in this, although virtual, like public space, like a reckoning of a queer tragedy that happened here in New Orleans that essentially the community was gaslighted about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just hearing you describe in your reading what it was like for people who were who were closeted and who had such high stakes attached to being able to publicly recognize that they went through a tragedy. Like, I know that there are so many queer tragedies that are not documented. And this, even though there is so much more safety now than there was a few decades ago, even with laws that have been passed and whatnot, there is still, I feel like, this like embodied sense of trauma that so many of us have lived in our personal lives, and that we just know about, but in this very like nondescript way. And I think there's something really clarifying about hearing actual stories that really validates the sense of where we come from, and almost in feeling like anyone who is part of the LGBT community shares these LGBT ancestors, and our collective history. And it's not about familial relation. It's like this other kind of shared ancestry, and that just that these stories and like having them shared in a public venue is really emotionally valuable for all of us, it's really just like a sense of collective witnessing. Like I have like family who perished in the Holocaust and who survived, and as both like a queer person and a Jewish person, like memory and remembering and telling stories has been such a big part of my life. And seeing that, having experienced like a lot of gaslighting about queer trauma in like the religious Jewish community I grew up in New York, like there was something so resonant about like something I experienced like 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, being told like, oh, like you can't talk about that because it's dangerous to be out, and you can't talk about the traumas that are being done to queer youth, because we can't talk about this because no one can be queer. And just being like, wow, there's still so many sectors of American society today where people are experiencing the same thing, though not on this as serious of like a physical tragic level. And just that, just the power of like public witnessing and remembering, and how just really counteracting all that gaslighting so that we can really embrace what we know has happened and like share that story and the importance of just having this like collective memory. I just like feel that on a real deep level. So I want to thank you for bringing that to our extended community and to all the places that you're bringing this to right now, because you've written this book. And thank you. Like this is really valuable.
Oh, thank you for listening. I always worry. I hope people value it, and I hope people understand the value of witness. And also, I keep thinking about how denial is probably one of the most powerful forces in human nature, and how on a daily basis, it's called being adult. We apply aspects of denial to our lives all the time, involving, oh, I'm not that hungry right now, or like there's just but when it comes to society-wide aspects of denial, it becomes quite poisonous, and then you create you create voids and inexplicable mysteries just filled with sadness, oftentimes in families, in communities, that I think history can help resolve. And I think it's better to have difficult truths like these out in public than to just have them be those kind of emotional chasms, because they don't go away. They don't go away, and they become multi-generational.
Yes. Thank you. I hear you. We have been listening. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Okay, good team. All right, well, this was a very nice night. So thank you all so well, and I hope this wasn't too intense for all of you, but like I really appreciate you all coming to listen and learn more about the Upstairs Lounge. I think it's so important to keep telling this story in New Orleans. And thank you so much, Courtney, for
introducing me and for participating, and also for your important work that you did with Stuart. I think we all owe you so much thanks for, I mean, your work with Stuart effectively, right, led to decriminalization of queer life in a major southern city several years before Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. And that was because of your determination. So thank you, Courtney. And I just feel honored every time